Hi, First Communion families. I have been thinking about you guys a lot and praying for you. I sure miss getting together with all of you. Usually about this time of year, we'd all get together and be planning to bake our First Communion bread together. Well, we can't get together, but Father Carver and I thought that it would be fun from our homes, I'm at home right now, and Father Carver's at home right now, to give you the opportunity to learn how to bake your very own special First Communion bread. So let's get started. When I cook at home, I like to put on an apron because my wife says that I'm kind of messy. And so I put on an apron to keep my clothes clean. You can have your special grown-up help you turn on the oven. For this communion bread recipe, you need to set the oven to 375. And then before we get too far in the kitchen, it's always important to wash our hands. It's really important to wash our hands these days. So let's do that before we do anything else.
Just like we put on our apron before we start cooking, let's put on Christ as we begin. Christ before us, Christ behind us, Christ under our feet. Christ within us, Christ over us, let all around us be Christ.
The special thing about bread for communion and for a First Communion is that it has to be unleavened bread. No yeast, no leavening agents. And that harkens all the way back to that story in Exodus that we read about. So this is unleavened bread. So there's not many ingredients. Let's look and see what ingredients are in here. For communion bread, you need 1 cup of wheat flour. That's important. Wheat flour, 1 cup. And you also need 1/2 cup of white all-purpose flour. You need 1/8 teaspoon of salt, not much salt at all. And this is 1/4 teaspoon. You're going to need 3 of these. 3/4 teaspoon of baking soda. You'll need 2 tablespoons of butter, and it's important that it's softened butter. So you'll want to leave it out on the counter for a little while before you start your recipe. And you also want to make sure that you don't have toast crumbs in it from the morning. So no toast crumbs, softened butter. Then you need 2 tablespoons of honey. And finally, you need 1/2 cup of hot water, not boiling water. So I boiled this water and then let it cool down for just a minute. You need 1/2 cup of hot water. And those are all the ingredients for communion bread. So the first step is to take your hot water, just 1/2 cup, make sure no more than 1/2 cup, and you want to put 2 tablespoons of honey into that hot water. With that second tablespoon, we can just leave it in the water because we're going to set that aside to mix together for a minute.
Now Brian said that all we need is 1/2 cup of water for our bread recipe. So I want to make sure that I add just 1/2 cup, no more. Oh, Tom Harrington's calling. His daughter's in First Communion. Tom, how are you? Yeah. No, I'm actually just doing some baking here at home. I just have to add a little water.
The next step is to combine our dry ingredients. The 1 cup of wheat flour, that's important. 1/2 cup of white flour. 1/8 teaspoon, not very much at all, of salt. One time in graduate school, a friend of mine was making communion bread and he put way too much salt in, and then Jesus tasted salty. So just 1/8 teaspoon of salt.
Brian said just 1/8 teaspoon of salt. That's all we need for this bread. Just a little bit, 1/8 teaspoon.
And then this is your 1/4 teaspoon. You want 3/4 teaspoons of baking soda. And once you have your dry ingredients all together, you can stir those a little bit. And then the next step is to take the softened butter and to cut the butter in. What that means is to take a little bit of butter at a time and sort of put that butter into the mix, kind of in different places. So you don't just plop the whole big bunch of butter in. Now our dry ingredients are combined and we've cut our butter into the mix. Now remember, we mixed our honey with the hot water and we let that sit for a little while. So now the honey and the hot water is all combined together. And so we take the honey hot water and we pour that into the dry ingredients, just like this. And then stir the mix until it all combines together. Gradually the butter will melt and the honey water will mix with the flour and the dry ingredients. And pretty soon we'll be able to form it with our hands into something that looks like a loaf of unleavened bread. You don't want to stir it too much, just enough to get it to come together. So you see how all the sides, I've got the flour and the water and the honey and the butter all mixed. Just a little bit of stirring like that. Very gently, you form it into a round disc. You want it to be not near as thin as a Frisbee, but you don't want it to be too thick. And so, do you see how that's about that size and thickness right there? That's starting to look just about right. That size and thickness. Once you have it that size and thickness, you can set it on your ungreased cookie sheet with your parchment paper. Again, we're just forming, we're not kneading the dough. You don't want to knead the dough. And then, so you get it ready for sharing communion with all of your community, you want to score the top of the loaf. And so you cut lines into the top of the loaf just like this. And those lines will help it when the priest breaks it into pieces. Just like this. And there's our loaf ready to go in the oven. The second to last step, of course, is to put your bread already on the tray into the oven. It's preheated to 375 and it's going to bake for just 10 minutes. Into the oven you go. We'll see you in 10 minutes.
You know, when we read through scripture, we find the same words used over and over again. And as I look through my recipe cards here, I wonder if you and your folks could look through scripture and find the places where Jesus says he took the bread, blessed the bread, and shared the bread with those whom he loved.
So our bread has been in the oven for 10 minutes. It's important not to overcook the bread because otherwise it'll get too crumbly. And there's our timer. All right, our timer just went off. So now, hey, shh, timer, shh. Now we can get our communion bread out of the oven. Make sure you use a hot pad. Have your special grown-ups help you. And here comes a loaf of communion bread. How does that look? Pretty great, huh? Now here's the thing. We're not quite sure when your special first communion is going to be. So you can go ahead and eat this bread with your family tonight. It's not communion yet because it's only communion when we come together, when it's blessed and broken and shared with the whole community. But it's very tasty, especially with a little bit of butter and maybe some more honey. So you can eat your first communion bread as soon as it's ready, when it cools out of the oven. Share it with your family, and it can be a reminder that you're on this journey to first communion.
Everybody likes to receive mail. So I'm going to send you a little something as you get ready for First Communion. It's going to be a letter from me, and inside that there are going to be some scriptures for you and your folks to read aloud together. There's going to be an invitation to write your own grace as you have dinner or a meal at your house. And finally, a recipe. A recipe so that you can bake your communion bread at home, just like we will prepare that communion bread here for each and every one of you.